Okay, Provost Lee, you can get started. We're now live.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yi Li. I'm the Provost and the Vice President at John Jay College. Welcome to all of you to the kickoff event in the academic fair, the Office for the Advancement of Research, Racial Justice Research and Practice Dialogue Series. I would like to say a few words to characterize the series before we launch into the first event. This year-long conversation is meant to bring faculty, students, and our John Jay community together to change the way we teach and learn. In conjunction with other departments' great effort, this series aims to facilitate meaningful engagement with the scholarship by and about people of color, promoting equity in our curricular and attitude in the classroom. Not only do these events present new information and feature scholars of color, OER has also worked to provide resources for further learning and an opportunity to work as a group to outline and commit to the steps we will take to improve. The topics that will be addressed over the course of 8 events this academic year are broad, and we hope that everyone on campus, student and faculty alike, and friends in the broader John Jay community will find something of relevance to their work. So I thank you all for being here today and encourage you to participate throughout the year, as I know we all have a lot to learn, and this is a great opportunity to grow together. Now I would like to turn it over to John Jay's Dean of Research, Dr. Anthony Carpe, who will give us a few more details and to introduce our panelists today. Thank you.
Thank you, Provost. It's my pleasure to be able to kick off this series with today's event on health and mental health issues and the ways that trauma-informed pedagogy can play a role in promoting racial justice in higher education. We are delighted to welcome today's panelists, Dr. Michelle Chatman from the University of the District of Columbia, and Dr. Lenwood Hayman from Morgan State University. They will teach us more about these issues and help us to begin the process of learning and promoting equity that the Provost just described. I know that this will be a fascinating discussion and one that's long overdue. We're looking forward to applying the expertise and thoughtful input of Drs. Chatman and Hayman to our journey of making our campus more just and to better meeting the needs of our student body. Before we get started, I'd also like to thank our partners in undergraduate studies and our faculty advisors who have put in a great deal of time and effort into creating this series. First, Monika Son, who is also serving as the facilitator of today's event and the workshop that will follow in 2 weeks. Also, Jessica Gordon-Nemhard and Jose Luis Morin, who have helped us organize and create this series. Also of note, Dean Dara Byrne, who really has been with us in coming up with the idea for this series and helping us organize it. And special thanks to Dan Stageman and Rachel Friedman, who have been the hard work behind the scenes of putting all this together. We've received a great deal of guidance and support in creating a series that would contribute something to the many discussions about racism and equity that we've been having and will continue to have here at John Jay. Before turning this over to our moderator, I'd like to make one last note about the format of these events. We've organized a series of 4 two-part events over the coming year. The first part of every pair will be a lecture by a noted set of scholars to help inform the community of issues and research about racial equity and/or disparities. The second event will be a workshop for John Jay community members, during which we will come together to discuss the lecture and associated readings and ways to improve our teaching, research, mentoring, and other interactions with students and colleagues. The workshop associated with this lecture will take place on October 28th during community hour, and we'll continue to share information about how you can join that discussion. Now, let me turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Monika Son. Dr. Son is a tenured assistant professor and chair of the Percy Ellis Sutton Sikh Department at John Jay. She has been at the college for more than 17 years, serving in a variety of capacities, including as coordinator of counseling and peer mentoring for the department. Her scholarship focuses on integrating a decolonizing framework into the education and justice curriculum, training faculty, creating new healing and contemplative practices for women of color, and providing educational access for marginalized groups. She holds a PhD in developmental psychology from the CUNY Graduate Center and a license in mental health counseling, a practice she brings into her work in education. It's my pleasure to introduce Monika Son. Monika?
Thank you, Dean Carpe, and thank you, Provost Lee, and thank you to my colleagues and panelists, which I will introduce in just a little bit. Thank you all for attending today's session. It came from a lot of thinking and collaboration and conversation and dialogue about everything that's been happening at this time, but also just out of the experiences that some of us hold. And we'll talk more about that as we introduce our panelists. Before we begin, however, it's hard to not see you all, but knowing that we all have busy lives, even though we may be working from home, we may be coming from class or another meeting. And I would like to open the conversation with an invitation to settle in our bodies. So if you could just take a moment and find a comfortable seat. And those of you out there in the Sikh department know what we're about to do. Just take a moment and begin to settle into your body. And what that means is really just finding your natural breath. So taking an inhale and an exhale. And we're going to do this 2 more times at your own natural pace. Inhaling and exhaling. And as you begin to settle in your breath, notice the sensation at your feet. Perhaps you're standing or likely sitting. Just notice the sensation of your feet touching the ground as you continue to inhale and exhale. And if you are sitting, notice your seat, that sensation of you touching the seat. So noticing your feet and your seat, allowing your body to settle into your breath as you allow yourself to be supported. And as you continue to settle into your breath, I would like to invite you to listening to a few affirmations of what I would like to offer in this session for us all. and you can allow them to resonate with your breath and with your body. And I will begin. I am here. I am here to listen. I am here to learn. I am here to lean in. I am here to support. I am here to grow. Continuing to settle into your breath, inhaling and exhaling, allowing those words to resonate in any way that they can. And inviting us to acknowledge that although we are not at the John Jay campus, we just celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day, acknowledging that our campus sits on Lenape land. Acknowledging all of those who have come before us. All of those whose shoulders we stand on. And coming back to that sensation of being grounded at your feet and seat, coming back to your breath. I invite you back into the space. Where we will begin our program for this afternoon. So I would like to introduce to you all Dr. Michelle Chatman and Dr. Lenwood Heyman Jr. I will start with Dr. Chatman. Dr. Chatman is an associate professor in crime, justice, and security at the University of the District of Columbia. Her research centers on the health and well-being of Black communities. She has authored peer-reviewed articles and book chapters on the impact of gentrification on Black communities in DC, the psychosocial needs of Black women breast cancer survivors, urban youth development, African spirituality, and decolonial pedagogy. Dr. Chatman is a sought-after speaker on mindfulness and contemplative approaches. She is particularly interested in how these approaches help to support liberated learning environments that center healing, justice, and belonging. She is a fellow in the Interdisciplinary Research Leaders Program, where she serves as principal investigator on the Project Youth Mind Study, an innovative violence prevention initiative for youth that integrates culturally relevant mindfulness approaches, restorative justice, the arts, and social justice education. And Next we have Dr. Lenwood Heyman Jr. Dr. Heyman's current research focuses on enhancing social emotional intelligence amongst Black people living in the United States via contemplative practices in efforts to disrupt the white supremacist narratives that impose challenges to their overall well-being. As an activist, Dr. Heyman offers radical love by supporting and transforming positive health outcomes for devalued and marginalized communities. Dr. Heyman uses his mindfulness training to initiate and cultivate safe spaces for engaging in meaningful health-promoting dialogue, both inside the classroom and beyond. He joined the School of Community Health and Policy at Morgan State University as an associate professor in August of 2019. As a practitioner of radical love, Dr. Heyman is guided by the perception that love is most effective as an offering, not as an investment. As a teacher, Dr. Heyman offers this radical love by inspiring marginalized and social justice-minded scholars to engage in critical analysis to destroy the incomplete narratives established about the communities from which they come or the communities that they serve. As a researcher, he operationalizes radical love by using a resilience-informed lens to address the social, psychological, structural, and environmental influences in underprivileged and marginalized populations. So it is with pleasure that we are here with them to hear and discuss this topic of racial justice. And as we continue, we will engage in a conversation. You'll be able to submit questions at any time through the Q&A panel in your chat. And there will be a period after the discussion where we'll open it up to the questions and the panelists will be able to respond. So thank you again for your openness and willingness to attend today's session. And with that, we'll start with the first question. Michelle and Lenwood, can you tell us about your work? And as you describe what it is that you do, I'm wondering also if you could share how you locate yourself in your work, meaning your values, your gifts, and your perspectives. What do you bring, you in particular, to your scholarship? And we'll start with Michelle.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for having me here today. This is quite an honor. Well, as you said, I'm an associate professor at the University of the District of Columbia, which is actually where I completed my undergraduate studies in sociology and anthropology. I'm a native Washingtonian, and those are actually really important parts of my identity. UDC is our public institution for higher learning in Washington, D.C. We are rooted in a history of social justice and racial justice. Our oldest predecessor institution was the Myrtilla Minor Normal School for Colored Girls. And that is an identity that I hold deeply. I like to say that UDC, our predecessor institution, was formed for me, because it was. And so the work that I do in addressing issues of justice and equity and healing for Black communities is very much tied to my identity as a Black woman, as a Washingtonian, a city that I love very much, and that is currently faced with the fastest growing rate of gentrification in the country, according to some, which, as we know, is tied to lots of health outcomes and quality of life considerations and questions around belonging and resources and opportunities. So that is part of who I am and how my particular positionality and identity shows up in my work. I am trained as an anthropologist, but I think I entered that field because I very much love storytelling and narratives and experience. I wanted to be Zora Neale Hurston, although that role was already taken, right? That's who I wanted to be. And what I loved so much about Miss Hurston is the way she elevated and amplified Black Southern culture, and not just in the United States, in the southern part of the United States, but in other places as well. How she absolutely loved and amplified Black people, our language, our ways of being, and really offered it to us as a gift and as a source of resilience, pride, and self-knowledge. And I see myself as doing that to some extent in the work that I do at UDC and in the community and around the country, in speaking about contemplative approaches. And I know this is one of our other questions, but I think these approaches help bring us back to ourselves and help remind us of our connectedness, our common humanity. And so I'll stop there and allow Lenwood to answer the question.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to my colleagues who I love very much. I got to start off with love, especially for you two. So I'm very grateful to share this space with you too. Monika, thank you for the invitation, and thank you to Dan and Dean Carpe and the OAR and the Provost Lee. When I think about my work, the thing that comes to mind the most is passion and caring. I'm trained as a psychologist with specialties in social psychology and health psychology. So when I finished my program, I entered into postdoctoral training in public health, specifically because I felt like that was better suited to my frame of perspective, if you will. Specifically, I've always been interested in a multidisciplinary approach to health and well-being. I was trained, however, more from a really in a colonialistic research methodology in terms of looking at what's missing from a community, or looking at deficits, looking at health disparities. And most of my early work is indeed on those topics, eating behaviors in African-American women that contribute to health disparities, specifically obesity and overweight in African-American women. And as I progressed along that particular pathway, I realized that it was difficult for me to maintain my passion for research using this deficits perspective. And it, I'm sure not coincidentally, coincided with my introduction to mindfulness and contemplative practices. So when I began to contemplate how I could show up more completely in both the classroom as well as in my research. And I know, like Michelle mentioned, we're going to talk about this contemplative practices more extensively a bit in a little bit. But as I engaged in the me search, if you will, of contemplative practices and mindfulness, I realized that only a portion of me was able to show up, and that portion of me that was showing up was not as satisfying to me. It was non-sustainable. And I realized that if I was going to continue to engage in research on these, quite critical topics, I had to figure out a way to do it in a way that was going to be not only sustainable to me or for me, but to the communities that I serve. So when I shifted from a health disparities perspective to a health resilience perspective, it was absolutely influenced by contemplative practices. And as I dove deeper into the me search, if you will, and how contemplative practices resonate with me and help me sustain my trajectory, in academia, I realized that there are a great number of practices that I already engage in. And if I was engaging in those practices, and those practices were influential in terms of helping me to get through my doctoral education, helping me to get through finding a job in academia, around helping me to maintain my sense of, again, meaningfulness and passion while in academia, I realized that, well, it can't be just unique to me. Perhaps there are other practices that individuals from the communities on which I focus, that they engage in, that allow them to maintain themselves, that provide them some tools to be resilient in the face of marginalization, colonization, gentrification, all of the Asians, if you will. And so when I transitioned over to Morgan, I figured it was a fantastic time for me to be able to look more intently and intentionally at the influences of resilience-based practices or resilience-focused practices, and to highlight those as processes for overcoming those aspects that I mentioned earlier, those well-being detracting or those health reducing factors and effects. So I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you both. So we are in a pandemic in the age of COVID. We are also getting ready to elect a new president. We have witnessed civil unrest in our communities in this country, not any different from things that have happened historically, but different sense of the activism and the depth of what is happening and who is involved in this activism, and also the understanding of how race and structural inequities impact specifically Black and Brown communities. So my next question was actually going to ask you, it was more of a disparity focused question, but both of you mentioned the word resilience. And I was wondering if you could speak to helping us understand how we see and understand or perceive or detect resilience or grow resilience in Black and Latinx communities in this time. And if you could speak to how this resilience can exist in amidst the structural inequities.
So I'll go first. So it's a challenge. I'll just acknowledge that first. And it is a challenge because in this cultural context, we are used to thinking about rugged individualism and you can make it, you can do it. You know, life is hard, times can be tough, but be resilient, be strong. And to some extent that negates or doesn't allow us to fully appreciate the very deep structural and systemic inequities that many of us live with on a daily basis. And so it's a matter of honoring a people's culture, resilience, their existence, just, you know, acknowledging that they are here and they may have their own particular ways of supporting their resilience that may or may not align with the way resilience is spoken of in the medical industry or even in higher education, right? It's a matter of tending to that and acknowledging that, and then also acknowledging that there are systems in place and policies in place and even practices, ways that we engage with each other around race and around stereotypes or what have you that actively do harm to people. And they cannot persist. They must be dismantled. Systems must be recreated so that they do not perpetuate inequities and harm. So it's a matter of holding both of those, needing to be resilient individually and also collectively as groups of people, and then also inviting an examination and a dismantling of the very systems and structures and practices that many of us engage in, perhaps unwittingly, that actively do harm. And so I talk about some of this in my work. In one of my talks, Healing the Harm in Schools, I talk about how Black youth are 3 times as likely to be suspended from school and incarcerated, and Latino youth twice as likely. And you know, when we begin to unpack that, yes, youth of color are very resilient in school. They're leaning on their families and communities, and they're showing up. And even now, in this particular time, you know, young people are doing the work. They're doing the very best. They may not have the access to technology. You know, they don't have the support of their teachers in the same sort of ways that they did or would if they were in schools. But, you know, they're resilient. They're making it. They're getting homework done, working into the evening. And at the same time, you know, in schools, we know that oftentimes students fall back on some of those racial narratives around children's behavior and what is acceptable and what is not. And unfortunately, children of color and poor children and children with disabilities are disadvantaged in school oftentimes when it comes to being suspended or expelled from school. And so, you know, we've got to look at and shore up students' resilience, community resilience, and then we've also got to make sure we're creating systems and reshaping systems so that they don't do harm, so that we don't have to, you know, struggle and prove our worth and our capabilities all the time.
I can see right now I'm going to love following behind Michelle in giving answers, because I swear it's like, I don't know how many basketball fans are out there, but I swear I feel like she's just throwing the ball up and I'm just gonna grab it and, you know, try to dunk it. I'm gonna go backwards right quick. But one of the things, if we focus, if I focus, I should say, specifically on some of what Michelle mentioned, in the book Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown, she specifies the importance of starting with small changes first en route to realizing or working towards broader scale changes, right? Wider changes. And so when we think of how we grow resilience in Black and brown bodies, the first place that we start is with the planting a seed within ourselves. The change that we can cultivate within ourselves, or let me put it like this, until we are able to cultivate the changes that we want to see within ourselves, and I'm saying ourselves as educators, I'm saying ourselves as those of us who have the privilege to come before these audiences, before these groups, if not daily, weekly, until we cultivate and maintain those changes that we want to see in the system, in the structure, in these Black and brown bodies. Until we do that for ourselves, it's going to be virtually impossible for us to do it for them, to do it with them. And reason being is, even for me, in this body that's racialized as Black, African American, in this male body, even when I show up, I'll just speak specifically in the classroom, even when I show up, there's already a perceived difference in othering, if you will, because I'm the professor, right? I'm the educator. So when I show up, everyone, the expectancy, the expectation, I should say, is that I'm the one who has all of the juice, if you will. I'm the one who has everything to offer. So everyone is supposed to listen to me. One of the ways that I disrupt that narrative en route to highlighting the importance and really helping to grow resilience in the students that take classes with me is by doing my best to decentralize the leadership structure in the classroom. And what I mean by that is most of my assignments in my research methodologies courses are on teams, and all of the points of evaluation are influenced by teams, are completed as a team. So what that means is, very quickly, students have to figure out ways to work together as a small team, no more than 3 or 4 people, work together as a team to reach these objectives that grow ultimately to a larger outcome at the end of class, right? So the way that influences resilience, there are different practices that I engage in the classes that help them realize the skills that they are already bringing into the classroom with them, regardless of whatever degrees that they hold. One of the most effective yet, untrue myths, which, myth is, generally untrue. One of the most significant and successful myths that has been perpetuated is that you have to have a degree in order to be seen as an expert on something. You have to have done something via this broader system of generalized evaluation, which is academia as I see it. If you don't have that documentation to prove that you can think the way that you've been socialized to think, or the way that we as the individuals in academia have been socialized to think, unless you can demonstrate that you can think the way that we want you to think, then you are not an expert. That is one of the most significant disservices that we can provide to students who take classes with us. And it is one of the most efficient routes to sapping resilience in those very same students, because once again, there's this competition that they have to enter into for attention from me or from you, from us as the educators. Hey, look at me. I know what I'm talking about. I don't yet have a degree or whatever, which is why I'm sitting in your class, but I want to demonstrate to you, I want to prove to you that I belong here. When most importantly, I believe that it's incumbent upon us to help them prove to themselves that they belong here. How do we consistently demonstrate to the students that take our classes or that work with us that they belong, that this is an environment for them? Well, one of the things that I had to do is I had to overcome imposter syndrome, which still acts up every now and again, and realize that I have a place in this classroom. And I had to be secure in who I am completely, not pieced up, but completely. I have to be secure in who I am in order to help them see, all right, this is how you will be rewarded with social capital if you show up completely. So just to recap, plant the seed of resilience within ourselves. What changes do we want to see? How can we start out small and engage in those changes? Once we begin to engage in those changes, we become more aware of the individuals who are around us, and we form a team to help us continue along the pathway, along the route of realizing those changes that we ultimately want to see. Resilience is no different.
Thank you both. I'm taking deep breaths here because a lot of what you're both saying resonates with my own experience, and also as an educator at the college, and working closely with students in all the years that I have. This desire for belonging that we all have, and that impacts us, those of us who look like us, in different ways. This internalized oppression that is founded upon the narratives, as Michelle was saying, about what we can and can't do in this space, right? You both mentioned practices and being contemplative educators. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about what that is and why it's so important, and to your integrative pedagogy of undoing oppression, racism, and speaking to issues of power and privilege within the areas that you teach.
So I think that my discipline of anthropology and to some extent sociology is very much aligned with contemplative approaches already, right? Anthropology is about understanding people, understanding their lived experience from their perspective. It's about seeing people, knowing people. It's about taking the perspective of the other, not in a demoralized, devalued way, but taking a perspective other than one's maybe natural or natal perspective. And so honestly, I think in the way that I learned, in the way that I taught, I was using contemplative approaches, not knowing that they had a name, if you will, right? And some might argue that, previous iterations of contemplative pedagogy have been called other things, holistic teaching or holistic education or what have you, teaching the whole student. And so when I learned about contemplative approaches or contemplative practices, it was very resonant and attractive to me because I could identify myself in that, right? I could see where, this is very aligned. This is what I do. I really do try to listen and use narrative and use my experience and use silence and think about pacing and try to be attuned to some of the other dynamics happening in the classroom and in the institution, in my students' lives that impact their ability to be present and to learn. So in my instruction, I use a number of approaches. And honestly, these approaches have also allowed me to show up more fully as an integrated educator, if you will. Because I think one of the ways in which we do our students a disservice, one of the ways in which we don't invite belonging, is when we sort of cut ourselves off and we subscribe to this idea, I have to be this way in order to be a professor, right? As Lenwood was saying, I'm the authority, I have all of the knowledge, I'm the instructor of record, I will be grading you, and this is the way we comport ourselves in academia, right? And that is very much not me. Of course, I am a professional and honor boundaries, but I want my students to know that I have a family, that I love the arts, that I sing, that I love to explore, you know. And when we allow ourselves to really embody this sense of belonging in our physical bodies, in our classroom, in our discipline, our students can see that authenticity. And we, by virtue, invite their authenticity, right? We allow them to fully show up and be their full selves in the classroom. And then we use, or I use approaches that kind of nurture that, whether it's silence or narrative writing or what have you. It's a range of approaches, and it really varies. It varies from class to class. And so just really briefly, for this semester, we're all doing online instruction, and in some ways I've been able to be more consistent with contemplative approaches in my class, right? In some ways, this virtual space requires that we pay attention to the pace and the volume, and it requires that we type some notes over here because maybe somebody didn't get it, or they can get it in a different way if we put a note over here or put it on a slide. And it requires that we kind of wait for each other because sometimes there's a lag, and it's a better way of showing up for one another. So in all of my courses this semester, we have at least 5 minutes of a practice before we go into content. And I ask my students, how are you doing? Check in, right? And we may look at an image on screen that I upload. We may listen to jazz. We may focus on our breath. We may do a little bit of free writing, because we learn with our whole bodies. And learning is social and emotional, and it's contextual. And I want my students to understand that all of that is a part of the learning and sharing experience, and it is welcome in our time together.
One of the things that I like to focus on as specifically and intentionally as I can is the practice of our iterative practices. In other words, practices that build on previous practices, right? And so what I mean by that is I am strategically transparent with students that take classes with me. And that is being transparent enough to invite students to mirror or to, I'm modeling transparency in a way that is intended to increase the likelihood that students will then be able to share where they are, what they are experiencing, what challenges or barriers that might be happening for them. And the intention behind that isn't to obviously, be provide therapy or anything of that nature, but it's really to begin to form a container of trust, which is what I heard Michelle alluding to earlier when she was talking about the way that we model for the students that take classes with us and the students that work with us, the way that we model how to interact, the way that we model listening, the way that we model what we share and when we share it is how we influence them engaging in similar behaviors or engaging in practices that will allow them to show up more completely and more clearly as well. When we think about the idea and the concept of belongingness, that is so critical and crucial to the classroom, to health outcomes, primarily because I'll speak specifically into the classroom and then broaden it out to health outcomes in general. But as we engage with one another, and let me be even more specific than that. So there's an activity that I have that I learned from a colleague of mine. It's a contemplative practice. The colleague of mine is Kakali Bhattacharya, and she is a brilliant qualitative researcher. And she has an exercise where she puts several personal items in a box and closes that box, takes that box with her into class. And the focus of the lesson, if you will, is how do we, as the researchers, if you will, or as the students in the class, how do we learn what's in that box? I've had students ask me, well, Dr. Heyman, can we see what's in the box? I'm like, no, I'm not going to show you what's in the box. I just met you. I usually do it the first or second day of class. I just met you. I don't know you. Why would I share something that I've already said is personal with you just yet? You have to demonstrate to me that I can trust you with letting you in. So throughout the course of this particular exercise, what students are able to learn quite efficiently, and this is especially effective in a research methods class, the questions that we ask are influenced by the perceptions that we have. The perceptions that we have are influenced by our life experiences. Unless we as educators are willing to admit that our perspectives, our perceptions, our experiences often show up before the students do, we are ultimately engaging in a disservice to them before we even meet them, before we get any assignments from them, before we get any work from them. So the way that I use contemplative practices in the classroom are in attempts to get to know students a bit more, but really it's in ways and processes to assist the students in getting to know who I am, getting to know my background, getting to know my training, and helping them to realize that the same way that I was able to navigate my training, I humbly believe that, or helping them to realize that they can be just as successful in navigating, their training as well.
Thank you both. We're now moving into the Q&A portion for the audience. There's some questions that have come into the chat, and one of the questions that's related to some of the things that the three of us have spoken about is this idea of the aftermath of white supremacy. And the question, first, what I hear both of you talking about, this idea of bringing in a contemplative perspective, is this critical reflection of yourself, right? And who you are, what this body brings into the classroom with all of its experiences, contextual background, trauma, oppression, privilege, power, critically reflecting on those parts of ourselves, which is everything that we bring for ourselves and for our students. So this notion of white supremacy, one of the questions is, can you recommend tools that people of color can engage to navigate systems of white supremacy?
I'll say some of the tools that I've used, and I don't know that I would call them tools, but one has to do with perspective and truth. And understanding that even with the self-work, the reflexive work, we live in a larger social environment. Many systems have been set up for us. They've been in existence for a very long time. Certain voices, identities, and experiences are more valued and centered in some of those spaces. So I would say one of the tools is paying attention to what you're consuming in terms of what you're reading and how you're regarding yourself, and making sure that you have critical work in your library. And then having allies in your institution, in your community. I mean, I'm thinking of the survival tools that I use to navigate graduate school, a predominantly white institution, first person in my family to pursue graduate studies. And, you know, it's a completely different environment. So what are the tools that I use to survive graduate school in this completely different environment? Allies, other Black women who in many ways were stronger than me, more grounded than me, and were able to tell the truth. And who taught me how to tell the truth and to stand in that truth and to stand in my value. Black women who said, you know, this is what we're being offered in the canon, in the discipline, but here are some other works that you need to know about, right? That are valuable, that should be centered in this discipline. And just helping me maintain a certain perspective that, again, there are systems and structures that really just need to be challenged and dismantled. And there is work for me to do within that. There is work that I can do as part of a collective movement. But certainly it doesn't all rest with me, nor should I, you know, try to do all the work by myself. You know, it's collective work. So in addition to that, you know, affirmations, my own personal tools, you know, the personal things that I use to move through life and to keep myself grounded.
Thank you, Michelle. Dr. Heyman, there was a question for you about the personal box analogy and how it influences your teaching experience again, and the notion of radical love and what does it look like in the classroom?
Yeah, thank you. I can combine both of those in this response, or at least I'll attempt to. I'll start with the latter first. When I speak of radical love, the thing that makes the love that I speak of radical is because I'm talking about the definition of radical that is at the root. When we think of what radical, one of the definitions of radical, it means getting to the root. It means getting to the foundational influence of whatever it is that we're putting, that we're using radical as an adjective of. The other definition that I use is extreme change, right? So something significantly different than what's been engaged or what's been enabled previously. When I relate that to love, I operationalize love as being dedicated to your well-being. So if I was to, when I opened up my comments and saying, Monika, Michelle, I love you both, it means that I am dedicated to helping you all, working with you all to realize your well-being, the highest state of well-being, your ultimate health outcomes, right? Ultimately positive and healthy. How that shows up in the classroom, specifically via that personal box exercise, or I call it the black box of research exercise, is having that willingness, first things first, to be to demonstrate something in class, to share with students in class something that, for all intents and purposes, I might not share without having this exercise. And what I mean is, some of the items that are in the box are a family picture of myself, my partner, and our 2 children, right? Another thing that's in the box is that I tend to put in the box rather consistently is another picture of my father and I in front of the Martin Luther King Jr. monument in Washington, D.C. I'm putting very personal items in this box. And so I am very clear, being very honest and upfront when they ask me, well, can we just see what's in the box? And I say no, because whatever is in the box are things that are very critical and very important to me. I am willing to share them with you, but it's going to take some work. There is a tit for tat model that I established by way of, I'm making the first step towards being open to sharing with you all by letting you know that there are real significant things in this box in terms of who I am. So as you consider what questions you ask, one of the things that I ask them is, are you trying to understand, or are you trying to learn what's in the box? Or are you trying to learn the reasons of why I put those things in the box? Because they often aren't the same thing. If we learn what's in the box, that's fine. That's okay. That's cool, right? That's a snapshot of what happened, what was influencing you at that particular time to put those items in the box. But if we can come to understand why you put those things in the box, ultimately it won't matter what you put in the box. It's the processes that lead to you putting those things in the box. And the reason that is so important when it comes to health and studying health, when it comes to training students on how to engage in research methodologies in public health, is that we can readily, easily observe health outcomes in our focal communities. It's very clear when suffering is taking place. We can see that. Are we interested in studying only why they are suffering? Are we interested in only observing that they are suffering? Or are we interested in the things that led to them suffering in the first place? What happens ultimately is, yes, these are very critical questions that I am encouraging students that take classes with me to ask. But I cannot expect them to get any deeper or any more critical than I am. So the way that I demonstrate to them that, hey, first things first, you are important. You have a place not only here in this classroom, but in the field that I am, preparing you to enter. I'm doing it in a way that lets them know that as long as you see me as such, I am your resource. When Michelle spoke earlier about barriers or boundaries, if you will, not barriers, but boundaries, that doesn't mean that I'm available to students 24/7. What that means is when I'm not available, I can tell them, yeah, I can't help you right now. But the key part is not, I can't help you, but right now. Check back in with me. Because again, as I mentioned in class, I do care about you. And yes, it is cumbersome. And yes, it does take a lot of work. And yes, it is, you know, in some instances exhausting. But if I'm tapped into a level of self-care, I'm maintaining that mindful awareness of, okay, my cup is beginning to run out. So when a student comes to me and asks me for something, Dr. Heyman, Professor Heyman, whatever, can you help me with this? I have a question about this. Can I talk to you about this? I am mindful enough to know that either I have it or I do not have it. And it is not beneficial to me, if we use that analogy that's used so frequently, especially now, it is not beneficial to me to take the oxygen mask off of me to put onto you. No, I need to maintain my connection to what it is that is empowering me, that is energizing me, that is motivating me, so that I can help you find your source of energy. Right? Michelle spoke earlier about resourcing, about making sure to have a community, making sure to have a network, tapping into other more knowledgeable others or individuals with a diverse perspective. All of these things, embedding them into the syllabus, including activities intended to help students learn these things within the class, relating them to the course content. These are ways that I'm able to demonstrate the importance of radical love, not only in the classroom, but outside of the classroom as well. That black box exercise is just one of the many that I use.
Thank you. And for our audience, there will be an upcoming follow-up workshop on the 28th, which is a Wednesday during community hour, open to the John Jay community only. There was a question about, as we prepare to send out more information about that workshop, there was a question about what kinds of questions you would like to leave for the audience. What do you want them to be asking of themselves, for themselves, whether they are in the role of faculty or student? What are some of those things? And we have about 3 minutes before we close.
I'll say one question is, what does a racially just, a racially healed John Jay look like? And what does it feel like? And for people who are coming from other institutions or places, what does it look like for racial justice and racial healing to be central to that place? And then this sort of gets to one of the other questions. Have I, just individually, examined my own racial narrative? What I've learned about race? On my campus, we're exploring, we're reading and discussing Rhonda McGee's book, The Inner Work of Racial Justice. And, you know, the work is both and. It is an inner journey and it is collective work. So it requires both sorts of inquiry, if you will, and the capacity to hold the very difficult answers and emotions that arise out of an inquiry like that. I remember when I was an undergrad student, I attended Howard for a little while, and then transferred later to UDC. And at the time, you know, my hair was different. I didn't have locks, right? This locks tend to make a statement about who you are. They make a statement about racial identity. At the time, I didn't have my hair like this. It was straight. You know, you had to go through a process to get your hair to be straight. And one of my very good friends asked me, why do you keep going through that process? Your hair is never going to be permanently straight. You do know that. It blew my mind. But it was a part of my racial narrative, part of my racial socialization, part of a life of questioning about who I am, how I see myself, how I value myself, how should I be, right? A much longer discussion, but I would invite folks to ask, you know, what does racial healing, what does racial justice look like if it were really centered in my organization, in my family, in my community, in my institution? And then have I begun the work of examining my racial socialization process and my racial narrative?
And quickly for me, one of the two questions that I would encourage everyone to ask themselves is, first things first, what evidence have I received that I belong here? And that is for students, that is for faculty, that is for everyone at John Jay, staff. What evidence have I received that I belong here? And then the corollary to that, what evidence have I received that I don't belong here? And then, after we ask ourselves those questions, who has been primarily influential in how I answer those questions? In other words, who has been the primary provider, trying to make up all these words, trying to sound extra sophisticated, provisioner, is that even a word? I don't know. Who is the primary provider of this evidence? Where have I gathered this data from most consistently? If I am a faculty, have I gotten this data from my colleagues? What's some of the demographics from those colleagues? If I'm a student, have I gotten this data from my teachers, from my instructors, right? What are some of the demographics of those instructors? When I look at those demographics, now it's time to do a comparison. It's, okay, I look at those demographics and I align their demographics to my demographics. In other words, what are the characteristics about these individuals that have been influential in making sure that I know that I belong here? Then what are those characteristics that I receive from those individuals who make me believe that I don't belong here? Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, how can I communicate this evidence? In research, what we talk about is the importance of, after we collect the research, how do we disseminate it? How do we talk back to the communities from whom we've gotten this evidence? How do we present it to them to let them know where we're coming from, or to let them know how they influenced or helped us, you know, in terms of our research objectives? How do we communicate this data back to both of these groups of individuals? How do we communicate the significance of this data, this evidence, back to the individuals who made us feel like we belong? And then how do we communicate this data back to those individuals? Do we have the tools? Do we have the strategies? How do we communicate back to those individuals who made us feel like we don't belong? You can come to us and ask us, listen, I might be kind of good with, you know, telling the folks thank you that made me feel like I belong, or influenced me, my belongingness, my perception of belongingness. But these other folks, yeah, I don't know about that. That's difficult. How do I do that? That's what we can workshop.
Thank you. Thank you, Lenwood. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, audience, for your attendance and your presence with us today. We've talked about so much and we could talk for more. However, it is 4:15 and we have to end. Please be on the lookout for more information about the October 28th workshop during Community Hour. You should be receiving something, the John Jay community, tomorrow on email with a registration link and with these questions that we've just discussed and some readings to support the work. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you on the 28th.